Hey guys, Ryan here at Signature Edits, and inside of this Lightroom tutorial, we are going to take a look at editing food photography inside of Lightroom. Are you ready? Let's do it. Alright, so this tutorial was brought to you by Michelle Berthels, who reached out to me on a recent email I sent out and said, hey, nice Lightroom tutorials. I would like to know how to turn my dull photos taken in normal daylight to bright OG full of color. How do you do that? Great question, Michelle. So we're going to head over into Lightroom and take a look together. Let's jump over here. Michelle actually sent me a few photos that she had from her portfolio for me to edit, as well as a couple of Instagram photographers who she likes and would love to emulate the style of. So there is Louise Kinberg, I'm not exactly sure how you pronounce these names, and Anna Nordenland. And we're just going to take a look at both of these different styles, because that's the thing about food photography. There are different styles of edits. If you take a look at Louise's portfolio, we have very bright, very vibrant colors going on here, high contrast. And then if we head over to Anna's, you see a much different kind of look. We've got more kind of a faded pastel, sort of minimalistic look to her photos. There's still contrast, there's still lots of color, but at the same time, it's definitely more subdued. So we're going to show you how to do kind of both of those with your photography. And of course, if you want to follow Michelle, you can check out her Instagram here. So jumping into it, let's start off by trying to recreate this style by Louise, and we'll take a look at this feed and just kind of get an idea of what her typical look is. And the first thing you're going to notice, if you're looking at the colors, obviously they're very bright and saturated, there's a lot of vibrance and high contrast going on here. But what I really want you to notice is what is actually going on in the photo itself. Don't think about the edit, just think about the composition. And what you're going to notice, if you look closely, is most of the time her photos have these really dark, rich backgrounds going on. So you look at the color inside of her background that she's actually taking her photos on, and that's adding an amazing amount of contrast to this image and just making everything pop off the screen. It's going to make the colors appear even brighter and even more saturated than normal. Whereas if you have a photo like this one that was taken by Michelle, well, the background is definitely not super bright and super dark, so it's going to be a little bit different trying to get that same kind of a look. This one is maybe a little bit more similar, but at the same time, if you were to switch the color of the background, I promise you, instantly you're going to see a different edit. And so one thing you need to be aware of when you're editing food photography, and any photography really, is if you're going for a specific look, you have to start by trying to get as close to that as you can in camera. Recreate what that photographer is doing in camera, and it's going to be way easier to do it in Lightroom. Alright, with that out of the way, let's actually get started editing, and I'll just kind of walk you through my process here. So I'm going to start just by taking a look at the basics of this photo, the white balance, the tint, the exposure, you know, the usual kind of stuff. The white balance actually looks pretty accurate to me, so does the tint and the exposure, so we're off to a good start. In general, I think that food photography tends to benefit from being nice and bright, so we'll raise the brightness there, and we'll maybe add a little bit of contrast, drop the highlights just a bit, and then we'll move on into the HSL panel. And the reason I'm kind of skipping everything into this HSL is because I think that's where a lot of these really deep, rich colors are coming from. So I'm going to try and find a photo that has a similar kind of coloring to it, and we'll match from that. So let's go maybe with, we could go with this photo, or how about this one? I'm going to zoom in here. And then we're just going to match the different shades. So I've got my HSL panel here, and I'm going over into the luminance. And rather than just raising the saturation of these different colors, or raising the saturation overall as a whole, which is going to give us this really kind of unnatural effect, I'm going to actually start with the luminance, because lowering and raising the luminance actually affects the saturation of the color. So if you don't know what the luminance panel does in the HSL panel, it affects the brightness of different colors. But it's kind of more than that. What it's really doing is it's adding white and it's adding black to the color. It's kind of like you're a painter and you're mixing your colors, and you add more black to make that shade of red darker, and you add more white to make it lighter. And as you make that shade lighter and you add more and more white paint, what's going to happen? The red is going to get less saturated. And the same goes for if you have a red shade of paint and you add more and more black, it's going to get less saturated. So kind of in the middle zone here is where it's typically going to be the most saturated color. However, if your color is too bright to begin with, so let's just zoom in here 1:1, even maybe a little bit more. Let's set it to 2:1 or 1:2. There we go. I'm getting everything wrong here. 2:1, 3:1. Perfect. Okay, so let's take a look at this color. If your color is too bright, so for example, these reds are quite a bit brighter than maybe they would have been naturally, so I'm going to lower the red, and you'll see that the color actually gets more saturated as a result. So here's before and here's after. That color just gets deeper and richer without actually raising the saturation. So it's kind of a more natural way of adding saturation to the reds. Here's before and here's after. Now, it might look to your eye like it's just getting darker, and it is, but it's also adding a little bit of contrast and saturation at the same time. And then we can add even a little bit more saturation. And I'm going to jump over into the hue and just try and match the hue of these reds to the red of this pepper and this paprika. So we'll grab the hue, take a little bit towards red, not too much because we want this to stay natural, but that's looking a lot more close. That's not good English, but you understand what I'm saying, hopefully. So here's before and here's after. We've added a lot of pop and a lot of saturation without really making it look oversaturated. Now the next thing we'll work on is the greens in this image, so we'll see. Maybe we can try and match it to the green of this zucchini. So we'll zoom in here onto some nice green leaves. And of course, these aren't going to match exactly because it's a different vegetable, but we can do a similar thing here. I'm going to take my luminance, grab the greens here, and you can see that we can really affect the colors in an amazing way just by dropping that luminance a little bit. We'll add some saturation to those greens. We could raise the saturation maybe a little, but I don't think that's necessary. However, maybe grabbing the hue and taking a little bit towards green will get it slightly closer to that zucchini-esque shade we're going for. Maybe darken a little bit more. Zoom out. So here's before and here's after. So we've added a lot more red, and the green isn't as pronounced, but that's just because greens you typically can't push quite as far. In my experience overall, you kind of got to be careful with greens because if you go too far, they just don't look right. Okay, so that's that. Now let's zoom back out here. In this particular photo, the lighting is very flat. It's not like some of her others that are brighter and higher contrast. So let's maybe grab a different example photo. Say this one. So this one clearly is brighter than our photo over here. So we'll just raise the exposure up a little bit. Maybe back off on the highlights just a little. And then I could go about and do whatever else I would normally do to my food photos. So perhaps I could take my texture up just a little bit. I can maybe raise the vibrance a tiny bit. And I think overall that's pretty close. Of course, because the composition is different and what's going on in the photo is different, we're not going to get an exact match here. But if we were to zoom out, say 1, 2, 3, and we do a nice Instagram style crop. Hello, let's set that to square. We've got that. And I think this would probably blend in pretty nicely on her feed. Maybe it's a little bit too high contrast, so we could always dial that back if we wanted to. And just some different options creatively. If you wanted to, you could go into the tone curve. We could raise our midtones, drop our shadows a little bit. That would add a little bit more pop to that image. Here's before and here's after. And if we wanted to, we can even add a little bit of a vintage flare. Just click kind of down here to add another point in our tone curve. Double click here on the very far left, and that will create this kind of clipped area. And you can see we can just add some kind of fadishness, some vintage film fade to our image if we want. A little bit here, something like that. Maybe drop our contrast even a little bit more. And then, of course, the rest is just kind of up to you. If you want to add a little bit of sharpening, we can use our Alt key just to dial things in. I'm going to bring my mask up and only sharpen the parts of the image I want to. If this is all new to you, make sure to watch my sharpening video. I'll leave a link up here somewhere. Go down here, and if this were a RAW file, I would do the camera calibration and lens corrections, but since this is not a RAW file, I don't have access to that information. So I'm just going to leave it there and apply this style to my other photos. If you wanted, you could go ahead and save this as a preset. So I will call this, I don't know, Signature Edits Foodie Bright. That's what we're going to go with. And we'll uncheck graduated filters and adjustment masks. Perfect. Don't need lens corrections because those aren't on there, or transform. That should be good. So I'll actually make this free to download along with our other edits that we go through today. Now we've got that preset, and you can apply it to your photos in the future. So let's grab a different RAW file, just see how we're looking. Good. So you can see it's pretty subtle. We don't want to take food photography too far in the editing room, simply because if you take things too far, they just look unnatural, and particularly with food, that's something you want to avoid. You want things to look fresh and delicious. You don't want them to look over-edited. And that's why using Instagram filters, for example, on your food photography typically look bad because they've just taken it way too far and the food doesn't look like food anymore and your stomach goes, that doesn't look so good. So we want to keep things looking fresh and delicious. Now, another tip for you, when you're actually taking your food photography, if you're struggling to get your edits looking the way you want, I always encourage you, go back to the way that you're shooting it. Look at the actual process of capturing that photo and do everything you can to improve that part. It's going to make a massive difference in your editing. Make sure you're using RAW if your camera supports that. Use natural light all the time, always if you can. For food photography, it's going to look way, way better. Or flash if you must, but really a nice window is going to give you the best possible results for food. Things like just getting your exposure right, so you want to shoot with the lowest possible ISO if you can. You also want to make sure that you have your exposure set properly, so it's not too long of a shutter speed, and you shoot on a tripod and keep that f-stop up a little bit. That'll keep things in focus really nicely. What else? Just make sure things are sharp and you have the correct white balance. All this kind of stuff, those basic essentials, are going to make everything in your photo work better. Think of it like food, right? If you love food and you love passionate baking or cooking, you know that the best ingredients are going to produce the best results. The same comes with your photography. Okay, let's dive into our next style over here. So we've got this kind of more pastel, more subdued colors going on here. So let's take a look at what that would kind of look like rather than our bright, saturated vibe. Let's grab an image that kind of matches up with what we're working with. So we'll go down here until we find something with some similar colors. And this is actually a good exercise for you just in general to practice just using your eye to try and emulate different photographers. Even if you don't necessarily like their work, sometimes just figuring out how they got the look they did is going to teach you a lot in the process and just get you comfortable with using Lightroom. Okay, something like probably this photo right here. It's a pretty close match. So you'll see the difference between the reds in Louise's photos. Let's grab something with a tomato here. Very saturated, very bright. Just kind of popping with color. And then Anna's photos, which these tomatoes, I doubt they actually looked quite that rougey. They probably looked a lot more red and saturated in person, and she dialed the reds back in Lightroom or in her editing application. But we'll see. We'll dive in. We don't actually have any reds in this photo, so maybe we could grab one that does. Let's go over to our grid here. Take a look. How about this one with the nice pepper? Okay, back into our develop module, and we'll do kind of the same process. We'll start by brightening things up. So this particular photo, you can see she's almost clipped some of the whites in this image. So I would probably avoid that, but for the sake of kind of emulating this style, we'll take it nice and bright, somewhere around, probably there. And you can actually hold the Alt key while you grab these sliders and see if you're clipping anything. So this area of the image is being clipped. We're losing information. So just make sure you don't do too much of that. Unless something is pure white and you want it to be pure white, then you don't need to worry about it. And we'll dial back on the highlights so that we can save, hopefully, that little bit. Perfect, somewhere around there. We'll increase our contrast a bit, but we'll do that through the tone curve this time, because I think you just have more options with the tone curve. So we'll drop the shadows. We'll raise up the midtones just a little bit. Something like that. Okay, so we're getting close to kind of the exposure that's going on here. It almost looks like maybe she's done a bit of a fade in her photos too, so we'll just fade the shadows and we'll fade the highlights. So what I'm doing here is I'm clicking once to create a new point, then I double click on the very outside, and that creates this kind of straight line that'll just clip everything below that and everything above it. And if you don't understand this tone curve, that's okay. I made a full in-depth tutorial on it. You can check out the video. I'll try and leave the link in here. Otherwise, just go to my YouTube channel. Okay, so that's looking sort of closer-ish. Now let's work on our colors. Dial back the exposure a little, head to our HSL panel, and we'll start by zooming in on this tomato. You can see it's a very deep, rich, but not super saturated tomato. It's living a good tomato life. Head in here. I like to get nice and close. I find it a lot easier to match the colors. You can see how far out we are right now. So we'll start by just lowering the luminance like we did before. But this time, instead of raising the saturation, we're going to lower it even a little bit more. Something like that. And then our hue, we can grab it, take it towards red maybe, or towards orange. Just try and find the best possible match. So we're still looking too saturated to my eye. Maybe drop the luminance even more. Somewhere around there. So you can see luminance makes a big difference in the saturation as well, or at least the perceived saturation. Maybe that's a better way to put it. Okay, zoom back out. You can see our reds are looking a lot closer. I probably took it a little too far, so we'll just back up a little bit. And then our greens, we can kind of try and match to these overall greens, but I think we're in a similar spot already. We could drop the luminance again. Maybe raise our saturation on the greens, that's okay. And then our oranges, those are definitely looking more desaturated. So let's see if we can affect our oranges here in a similar way. Probably, instead of dropping the saturation, I could just raise the luminance, because these carrots are looking very bright, so we'll do the same kind of thing. And then drop our saturation ever so slightly. Something like that. Zoom back out here. Okay, so we're looking not too far out. Now we just raise up our contrast maybe a little bit more. Oh, that was not helpful. And we'll just adjust our exposure as necessary and say, you know what, we're looking pretty close here in terms of the overall colors. Now, the reason that this isn't an exact match per se is because our composition is just different. So there are certain things that you're going to be able to emulate and match, and other things that you're going to need to get right and matched in camera. If you really want this specific look, you're going to have to get things a little bit more similar. So for example, what is kind of driving the drama in this shot is this big shadow from this breadbasket that is coming over here and working its way into the tomatoes. There's really deep shadows going on. Whereas the lighting in this particular photo, you look at the shadows underneath this can, they're a lot softer. There's not a lot of shadows going on underneath this spoon or under this onion. Whereas this, you can see just from the direction of the shadow, which is way over here from this breadbasket, that the light source was probably coming here almost parallel with the breadbasket to get these really long, dramatic shadows. And so definitely if you want to emulate that look, you're going to need to emulate the lighting in the situation as well. This photo, I think, is just a little bit too soft, not directional enough to get that quite the same. But we could try taking our shadows and just dropping them down. But of course, we're going to lose some brightness over here in this image, in this part of the image, so we'll just grab our adjustment brush, a little bit of exposure, and we'll just paint it back in this area. And in our last edit, I really didn't touch the adjustment brush much because it's more showing you how to get these different looks than it is about showing you how to get the perfect edit. Definitely, I would make sure to kind of smooth things out and enhance things with the adjustment brush. Make sure to grab attention to the areas of the image that you think are the most important. Maybe this can here, there we go. I'm going to have to do a little bit more down in this direction on this green foliage. We could even pull the shadows back up here maybe. Something like that. So there. That's kind of how I would go about approaching this style of edit. And of course, because she's got lots of different colors and stuff going on here, it's going to depend a lot on the image. And so we could save this as a preset. Let's just copy these settings. Try pasting it on a few photos, see what we're doing. Yeah, it's got a similar kind of look and vibe to it. Of course, you're going to want to make sure that you actually match things up in terms of lighting, in terms of getting the positioning, the background, and everything right. Because the difference between this background of wood and this background of wood is very extreme. We could try and desaturate the wood to emulate this kind of style. So let me just show you that. We'll grab our adjustment brush. I'm going to have auto mask on and press O to see what I'm brushing. And I'm just going to click here on these different areas of wood. Just do a really quick and sloppy job here. Erase it by holding the Alt key. And if you are not super familiar with the adjustment brush and auto mask and all that good stuff, I just made a video that you can check out as well. Goes into all of this and shows you some different shortcuts for how to get the most out of it. Okay, that is close enough. Then we're going to just desaturate that background. And you can see what's really interesting about this is if my saturation is high on the background versus if it's low, it really affects how the perceived saturation of these elements in the middle of our photo are perceived. So if we have a high saturation, I think that this just doesn't pop as much, whereas if we take that saturation down, all of a sudden, things are popping. Now the same would go if this was a different color. So if this was blue, for example, this isn't going to look good, but just to give you an idea, if we made this background blue, that's more purple, you understand what I'm saying. If the background were blue and dark, it's going to do a lot more in terms of making the rest of this photo pop out than if our background is kind of a very similar color and shade and saturation to the food going on in here. So we've got wood right on wood. I'd encourage Michelle, try putting this maybe on a concrete background or on a tile. Go buy a tile at Home Depot, something like that, and you'll get much more bang for your buck in terms of things just popping off of the background. Okay, so that's how I'd kind of go about doing that similar style of edit. Of course, this now looks completely different. It's going to depend on the photo, and you kind of have to dial things in. But that's overall how I go through matching up food photography and going through making sure that you get it right in camera first, because that's the most important thing you can do. And then after that, those kind of little tricks to just match your color, working on the HSL, adding a little bit of a tone curve to things, just going through, add some sharpening, of course. Dial it in. Make sure you apply your lens corrections, and if you want to, you can even go into the effects, add a bit of a vignette, and that'll have the same kind of effect of just making your elements pop out a little bit more. So here's before and after there. Now lastly, I want to take a look at one last photo that Michelle sent me over here, which is this photo of these falafels and salsa going on. And it's a great photo, but there's just something about it that's not looking right. And I think that's this salsa here. There's a couple things. The first is that it's not really in focus. You can tell when you zoom in, it's really not sharp. And so that's throwing things off to begin with. Your photos need to be sharp, so make sure if you're shooting overhead, have a nice high f-stop, maybe f5, f6, as much as you can get away with the light you're working with. That's going to benefit and get everything just that much more sharp. So there's that. The second thing is that the colors just don't seem to be working. They don't look really natural. If we compare the colors of, the red tomatoes in this particular photo with the red in the salsa, you can see there's a lot of saturation missing. It's very dark, and part of that is due to the lighting. There's really dark shadows in here, but not a lot of specular highlights, which is the result of basically more light would just improve this and have a lot more saturation in the photo. So getting it right in camera is huge. Now let me show you what I'm going to try to do to resurrect this, which is going to be just recreating the light conditions I wish had been there to start with. We'll do a radial filter, raise that exposure, and you can see the saturation is raised up right away just by brightening things up. So that is step one. Step two is going to be adding a little bit of contrast and maybe a little bit more highlights. Maybe even dial back the contrast, don't want to take it too far. Good. Brighten up the rest of the image, and we're going to have to dial this back now to match. So that's better. Now, because it's out of focus, there's only so much I can do here. I can go in and I can grab my sharpness and my texture and try and rescue it. But it's not going to be as good as if I had actually shot it in focus in camera. However, that's how I'd go about just kind of rescuing that saturation. Most of the time, if your colors aren't looking very vibrant, if they just don't look right, it comes down to the light that you had in your photo, the exposure you were working with, the ISO you would set your camera to. You want to shoot with a very, very low ISO. It's going to give you the best possible results. Really nice, natural light. Make sure to get everything in focus, and your photos are going to be so much easier to edit to begin with, okay? So that is the last thing I want to reference. Let's go over to our red pepper photo here and just show you what I would do to finish it off. I would definitely make this Lightroom window bigger. And there's just little things that you need to do when you finish your photos that are going to give them that extra little bit of polish, such as using the spot removal tool. If we zoom in here, we can really see that there are just some little bits of dirt or something. And if the spot removal tool is new to you, you can just grab and watch the free tutorial that I have elsewhere on the channel. Won't spend too much time on this. But I just want to give you kind of the idea that really when you're editing your photos, it's these extra little things that are going to make a big difference. They all add up. So you do 100 of these little things, and all of a sudden the photo looks way, way better. So just take your time, go through, make sure you get it to the best possible edit you can. That extra kind of 30 seconds, 2 minutes is going to make a big difference. Now, if I were batch editing photos, of course, I wouldn't be able to do this. That's why it's all the more important to get it right in camera so you don't have to spend as much time correcting things afterwards. Now, the same thing goes with this particular photo. This portion of it is definitely not as in focus, so we could go grab another radial filter, put that on there, sharpness up, texture up. I love this texture brush. It can rescue so many things. Something like that. And last of all, maybe we'll go down here to the effects and we'll do a little bit of a vignette. Change the midpoint slightly and dial that back. In general, if you're not sure how much of an effect to add, go until you think you have the right amount and then dial it back a bit. That'll make sure you never over edit things too much. And then a little bit of grain just to give it some of that kind of filmy vibe. I like to take my grain all the way up in the amount, take the size, and kind of refine it as I see fit. So that kind of looks nice to me. And then I'll dial the grain amount back. Because it's very hard to get these settings right when you can't really even see what they're doing. So I'll take that probably, I don't know, somewhere around here. Okay, so that photo is looking pretty good to me. I'm going to finish this tutorial for you and let you get to work editing your own food photos. I hope this has been helpful for you. If it was, do me a big favor, hit that thumbs up button. It really helps me in a huge way. And make sure to subscribe if you want more tutorials. Leave comments below if you want a future tutorial, have a request. Please let me know about it. I'd love to hear it. And if you want to, grab those free food presets we've created together today and get started editing. All right, I'll see you in the next video. Peace.